Gently, gently, we lean into our emotions, breathe into our emotions, pause and explore our emotions. And this leads us to greater peace and greater self-knowledge. Let's talk about it.
This is a beautiful thought.
Welcome. Let's talk about leaning into your emotions. So there's a bunch of strategies, techniques, or perspectives, ways of looking at our emotions when we have a kind of negative emotion, or what we might call a negative emotion. It might stick around for some time if we don't confront it. So what a lot of the time we'll try to do is try to bypass it, trying to distract ourselves from it, focus on something else so we don't feel it, which can be helpful, but it's not necessarily getting to the root of the issue, because a lot of the time when we feel an emotion, there is a point to it. Our emotions are not random. Now, it's not necessarily that you have an emotion like, oh, I'm in love with this person and that means we're meant to be together. Well, it's not quite that simple, or not quite that complicated, perhaps I should say, because when we feel our emotions, we start to interpret them, and the interpretation that we come up with isn't always correct, and sometimes it's some unconscious things that come out. But yes, it's true. Emotions have meanings, or they have messages for us. And when we can correctly interpret those messages, we'll find that we can leave those emotions behind. And I like to say, I used to say, squeeze the sponge dry. What does that mean? Well, there's a related concept of paradoxical intention described by Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning. So he says that, for example, Frankl had, I think it was talking from his own experience, he had a problem when he was young. He used to stutter all the time. But when he reflected upon his experiences, he found the only time that he didn't stutter was when he was caught on a tram without a ticket, and he intentionally tried to stutter in order to gain sympathy from the conductor, so he wouldn't have to pay a fine or get kicked off the tram or whatever it was. So that's the principle of paradoxical intention. Sometimes if we try to do something that maybe otherwise we would like to avoid, sometimes we can't do it, or we experience it in a very different way. So if you have some feeling like despair or fear, terror, sadness, if you feel it directly and you say, okay, I'm going to feel this as much as I possibly can, you might find instantly, actually in that instant, that you start to have a very different experience of that emotion. And it's not unpleasant. It's something else. I mean, maybe it's not entirely pleasant, but it's not unpleasant. Squeezing the sponge dry, you might call that, or paradoxical intention, trying to move deeply within that, or the other way of looking at it. My friend Alinka is studying Gestalt therapy, and she told me that when she had a recent breakup, it was difficult for her, but some of the lessons from therapy helped. She said, I leant into the emotions, leaning into them. And I like to think of this, my friend Chris is very into his body, I guess, trying to solve things in his body, like get more flexibility in vertebrae so he can have a healthy back and this sort of thing. And he found out about this idea, myofascial release. And what this means is, it's like people will take, for example, a lacrosse ball or a tennis ball, and they will lie on it. And because of the pressure, the gravity of their body pushing down against this ball, it will put some pressure into a muscle, and it will allow that muscle to release. Now, what Chris says to me is you want to ride the line of pain. So it is like you feel a bit of pain, but you don't get completely consumed by it. Or another way that people say it is it hurts so good. When it hurts so good, you're not completely consumed by it, but you can take it. And it feels like actually, something is getting better here. Something is improving. And that's how it is also with your emotions. Or, it's an analogy, not a perfect analogy, but feeling into your emotions, similar to releasing tension in your muscles, or just like with a massage. All right, you don't come in and just like smash the muscles. Well, sometimes you might, but you find the tension and you just apply, just the right amount of pressure to get it to release. Feels good. Now, sometimes I compare certain strategies for dealing with emotions to parents and grandparents. So you have this overbearing father, and what he does, he comes in directly and he's knocking on the door of your room. Maybe he even breaks down the door and he says, "Hey, what is going on? Tell me what's going on with you. Tell me what's wrong. I need to know now." And of course, what happens when you make those kind of demands? Well, the quickest way to inspire a gag reflex is to force feed someone. So it makes you recoil. It makes you as the child recoil. And likewise with the emotions, they act in the same way. They'll be like, "Hey, well, I'm just trying to do my thing. Leave me alone." And you won't find out what's really going on with the emotions. The other parent is the mother in denial, I guess. There could be other forms of the mother. Obviously, these are immature strategies. They're not the best strategies. And the mother in denial just pretends like she doesn't have that emotion. Or she even says to the emotion, "Well, I'll deal with that later." And what happens when she keeps saying, "I'll deal with that later"? It's like every time she has some dust to sweep up, she just puts it under the rug. Or, the junk goes into the broom closet and never gets cleaned. So these things start to build up and build up, which, sometimes it's fine to say, "I will deal with that later." Like if you're in a certain situation, maybe you don't have time to deal with your emotions. But if you deal with it habitually in this way, then eventually that broom closet is going to build up with a lot of mess. And it's going to be so much more difficult to untangle, so much difficult to tidy up over time. The other strategies, the grandparents, so they're a bit more wiser, a bit more patient. So you have the grandfather, and his strategy is like, well, what's going on? He gets close enough to observe, but it's not intrusive. So he gets a little close to the emotions, and maybe he starts to ask some questions, which in a way, they're intellectual. He says, "Okay, what does this emotion feel like? Where is it in the body? What is the texture, the color? Does it have a sound associated with it? Is it rough? Is it harsh? Is it smooth? Is it bright? What's the flavor of this emotion?" And by doing that, you can start to get a better idea of what's going on inside you, feeling it, but gently feeling it. The other strategy is the grandmother. And the grandmother, again, she has that safe distance. And at the same time, she just accepts the emotion. Just like I mentioned the other day when the sound selfie with on Erica Harris's podcast, The Work of the Empath, I mentioned that scene from the interview or from the video with Carl Rogers. And Carl Rogers says to the young black man, "You are free to feel anger right here with me." And the young man says, "You really mean that?" And Carl Rogers says, "Damn straight." And that's the kind of beautiful space that you can allow your emotions, or as I wrote in a lyric once, give yourself space to transform. So in that loving, allowing acceptance, that unconditional positive regard, as Carl Rogers described it, that is what can allow these emotions to transform. And perhaps what you once thought was negative will actually become a blessing. Thanks for listening. Have a wonderful day.
A beautiful thought.
Thanks for listening. Please remember to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, any kind of mechanical device which can enable its radio setting, and tune into the interdimensional frequency of a beautiful thought. That would be really cool if you did that. And most importantly, have a good time.
I wanna feel